These hieroglyphs mark a boundary at the edge of the sky and describe what waited past it. Inside the hypostyle hall of the temple at Esna, on the interior surface of the outer vestibule ceiling, there is a register of hieroglyphs that does not correspond to any known liturgical sequence in the standard Egyptian religious canon. The ceiling at Esna is among the most documented in Egypt. Serge Saunaron produced a 9-volume translation of the Esna text between 1959 and 1982, one of the most comprehensive epigraphic surveys in the discipline. The register in question appears in Volume 4 of that survey, Plate 83, catalogued under a single classification. Astronomical notation, function unclear. Saunaron translated the surrounding liturgical material in full. He did not translate the register on Plate 83. He identified it in a footnote as a boundary inscription and moved on. That was 1962. No dedicated published translation of that register has appeared in any Egyptological journal since. What Plate 83 depicts when read as a navigational document rather than a ceremonial one is a boundary. Not a metaphorical boundary between life and death, not the ritual boundary between sacred and profane space that runs through Egyptian temple architecture, a physical boundary. A location described with the precision the Egyptians reserved for engineering texts and star charts. A location above the earth, above the sky, above the region they called Nut, the arching sky whose belly formed the ceiling of the observable world. Above all that, and the inscription does not stop at locating the boundary, it describes what waited past it. Mainstream Egyptology has a complete framework for the Egyptian sky. The earth below, the atmosphere between, the stars above, and beyond the stars, the duat, the hidden realm through which the sun traveled during the 12 hours of night. That framework organizes the Amduat, the book of what is in the duat, describing the sun god Ra's nocturnal journey through 12 guarded gates. The Amduat exists in complete form in the tomb of Thutmose III. The framework is internally consistent. It accounts for every known sky text in the canonical literature. But Plate 83 at Esna does not describe the duat. It uses none of the Amduat's vocabulary. And the beings it describes at the boundary it marks are not Ra, not Osiris, not any figure in the dynastic religious canon. They are described with a single compound hieroglyphic designator that Saunaron, in his footnote, translated provisionally as those who do not require the light. In 62 years of Egyptological publication, no scholar has returned to that translation and asked what it means in physical terms. That question is what this investigation answers. If forbidden ancient history brings you here, subscribe now. Every week, this channel goes directly to the untranslated registers, the restricted archive footnotes, and the survey materials the mainstream conversation never reaches. What follows is what Plate 83 actually says, what 3 separate ancient traditions described at the same boundary, and what modern astrophysics has confirmed about the zone above the observable sky. The investigation begins with the text itself and with a fact about Esna that most visitors to the temple never encounter. Esna's hypostyle hall was not built on open ground. It was constructed directly over a much older structure, a fact Egyptologists have documented but not fully excavated. Geophysical survey conducted by the German Archaeological Institute in 2009 dated the lower foundation layers to a period significantly earlier than the Ptolemaic construction above them. The survey results published in the Institute's internal bulletin as a preliminary finding, noting those foundation layers as inconsistent with Ptolemaic construction techniques and appearing to echo structural alignments of pre-dynastic origin. That bulletin entry has not appeared in any major Egyptological publication. The survey was classified as preliminary pending further investigation. As of the last publicly available status update from the Institute, dated 2021, that investigation has not been completed. The ceiling register Saunaron, catalogued as Plate 83, sits directly above the point where the geophysical survey identified the deepest and oldest of those underlying foundation layers. That correspondence was not a fact available to Saunaron in 1962. The geophysical survey came decades after his work. The spatial relationship between the oldest foundation point and the location of the untranslated register was identified independently in 2017 by researcher Manu Saifzadeh, whose work on geometric relationships between Egyptian temple alignments has been cited in the peer-reviewed journal Göttinger Miscellen, published by the University of Göttingen. Saifzadeh noted the correspondence as architecturally significant and did not pursue the translation question. His analysis remained geometric. Nobody connected the two findings. The register itself covers approximately 2 linear meters of ceiling surface arranged in 4 horizontal text bands. The outer two bands use standard hieroglyphic notation consistent with the astronomical texts on the surrounding ceiling. Sonoran translated those completely. The inner two bands, directly adjacent to the central axis of the ceiling vault, use the non-standard vocabulary set. That vocabulary set contains 16 distinct hieroglyphic compounds. Sonoran provided provisional translations for 11 of them in his footnote. 5 compounds he listed as without parallel in the documented corpus. Those 5 compounds have not appeared in any published Egyptological word study since 1962. One of the 11 compounds Sonoran did translate provisionally is the boundary marker itself. The compound uses the determinative for a physical limit or edge, the same determinative used elsewhere in Egyptian texts to mark the boundaries of land parcels, the measured edges of mapped territories, the surveyed limits of canal systems. It is not the determinative for a spiritual threshold or a cosmic transition. It is the determinative for a located physical edge. The boundary on Plate 83 was not conceived by the people who carved it as a metaphysical idea. It was conceived as a location that could be placed on a map if you had the correct coordinate system. And the inscription proceeds from that location marker into a description of what exists past it, written in a vocabulary that does not appear anywhere else in the canonical Egyptian religious record. Except in one other place. The Naos of the Decades in the Cairo Museum, object number CG 9403, is a rectangular granite shrine dating to the reign of Nectanebo Pime, around 370 BCE, whose astronomical ceiling texts were analyzed in a 2005 paper published in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology by Egyptologist Joachim Quack of the University of Heidelberg. Quack's paper addressed the astronomical identifications carved into the Naos ceiling, the star tables, the decans, the calendar correlations. In footnote 47 of that paper, Quack noted that a subset of terms in the lower register did not resolve into the standard astronomical vocabulary and appeared to reference a spatial zone beyond the observable star field. He described this as a late-period theological innovation and did not return to it. That vocabulary subset in footnote 47 is the same vocabulary set that appears on Plate 83 at Esna. 2 separate inscriptions, one Ptolemaic, one from the 4th century BCE, both using non-standard compounds to describe the same zone above the star field. And the specific hieroglyphic phrase used in both locations to name that zone translates as the limit of the carried light being the term Egyptian astronomical texts use for what stars do, not the stars themselves. Not the light of the stars as a general phenomenon, the limit of how far the light is carried outward before it stops. Past that limit, the inscription at Esna says something was present, something the inscription does not call a god, something it does not name with any of the standard epithets Egyptian religious texts use when describing cosmic beings. It names them with a designator Sonoran translated as those who do not require the light. The hieroglyphic text in the inner bands begins, after that boundary compound, with a sequence describing the zone itself. The phrase Sonoran rendered as the region above the place where the light turns was flagged by him as unusual, because in standard Egyptian astronomical vocabulary, light does not turn. Ra's solar bark carries light in a directional path. Starlight emanates outward. Neither implies a limit at which the outward travel ends. The phrase implies the light was understood as traveling outward in a specific direction and reaching a point where that direction was extinguished. Modern astrophysics has a specific name for this phenomenon. The heliopause is the boundary where the sun's solar wind, the continuous stream of charged particles emitted outward in all directions, finally becomes too weak to push back against the interstellar medium. At the heliopause, the outward flow of solar energy effectively stops. Voyager 1 crossed into interstellar space in 2012, and the Voyager team's confirmation of that crossing was published in Science in September 2013, identifying the boundary through measured changes in plasma density on either side of it. The phrase, the place where the light turns, is not a technical description of the heliopause. The Egyptians had no instruments for measuring plasma density. But the conceptual content, a boundary above the sky at which the light's outward motion reaches its limit, is a precise functional description of what the heliopause is. And the inscription does not stop at the boundary. It describes what the boundary separates the observable sky from. The text names 3 characteristics of the beings past the limit. They are present without arrival. They do not move as the stars move. They were present at the first moment of counting. Present without arrival means they were not observed to enter the region past the boundary from any direction. They were not tracked crossing the boundary from inside toward outside. They were encountered already there, in the zone beyond the carried light's limit, without a recorded approach from any known origin point. They do not move as the stars move means they do not follow orbital paths. They do not rise and set. They do not trace predictable arcs across the sky. They do not have the periodic motion that defines every other object the Egyptians observed and cataloged in their sky texts. Every decan, every star group, every planetary body in the Egyptian astronomical record moves. These do not. And the phrase "they were present at the first moment of counting" invokes a specific compound glyph. The same compound glyph that appears on the pre-dynastic block catalogued as JE9289 in the Cairo Museum basement, labeled as "those who came before the counting of years." Not a casual verbal similarity. The same categorical designation, the same grammatical construction, applied to the same class of presence, at the same location above the sky. That convergence cannot be attributed to transmission from the Ptolemaic temple builders at Esna to the pre-dynastic carvers at Saqqara. The direction would have to run backward through time. The Esna texts are late period, Ptolemaic at the earliest. The block JE9289 dates to a context beneath the step pyramid complex at Saqqara that French Egyptologist Jean-Philippe Lauer, who spent more than 7 decades working at the site, described in his archived field notes as predating the surrounding architecture, not by years but by centuries. The stratigraphic analysis placed its construction before the accepted beginning of the dynastic period. 2 inscriptions separated by, at minimum, 2,000 years, more likely 3, using an identical compound glyph as a categorical designation for the same class of entity at the same spatial location above the sky. In a writing system as codified as ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, where grammatical structures were preserved with documentary precision across dynastic periods, that identity means the compound was a fixed categorical label, not a creative metaphor invented twice in isolation. The beings described past the sky boundary were consistently identified across the entire recorded span of the Egyptian tradition, from its earliest pre-dynastic layers to its latest Ptolemaic expression. But the convergence does not stop within the Egyptian record. In 2003, Assyriologist Wayne Horowitz of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem published a comprehensive analysis of Babylonian cosmic geography through the press of Eisenbronze. The analysis included translation and commentary on a Babylonian tablet catalogued in the British Museum under accession number BM92687, a Neo-Babylonian period text describing the structure of the sky in 7 ascending zones. The 7th zone, the outermost, is labeled in Akkadian, with a phrase Horowitz translated as "the region beyond the path of the stars where the unchanging ones reside." Unchanged from what is not specified in the text. Unchanging how is given no further elaboration. But the structure of the description is identical to the Esna register. A boundary at the outermost limit of the observed star field. A class of entities past that boundary. Entities described not as gods in the standard Babylonian theological sense, not with the epithets and titles that identify cosmic powers in Babylonian religious literature, but as presences characterized by the absence of motion and the absence of change. Horowitz's translation is peer-reviewed and unchallenged in Assyriological scholarship. Tablet BM92687 is accessible in the British Museum's online catalogue. The parallel to the Esna ceiling register is not referenced anywhere in Horowitz's analysis because Horowitz was working in a different field and had no occasion to survey untranslated ceiling bands in Ptolemaic temple. Architecture. The convergence was identified by independent researcher Andrew Collins in a 2018 paper presented at the Origins Conference in London. The Egyptological literature has produced no published response to that identification. A third convergent source exists in the Vedic astronomical tradition. The Rig Veda, in Mandala 10, hymn 129, the Nasadiya Sukta, contains in its 4th verse a description of the observers of the pre-creation state. Those observers are described in Sanskrit as dwelling beyond the limit of the carried sky. The carried sky in Vedic usage is the observable vault of the heavens as perceived from Earth, beyond its limit. The same spatial designation, the same class of presence past the same boundary. 3 separate ancient traditions, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Vedic, describing the same zone above the sky, using the same vocabulary of limit and boundary, attributing to the same spatial location the same class of entity that does not require the light, does not move as the stars move, and was present before the observable world began. The question that convergence raises is whether the boundary they were all describing has a physical correlate that modern science has now identified. The heliopause accounts for the phrase "where the light turns," but the texts are more specific than the heliopause alone. The description of entities that do not move as the stars move points beyond a heliospheric boundary to a different kind of limit. Everything the Egyptians observed above the earth was in motion. Their decans, the 36 star groups that mark the hours of the Egyptian night, rose and set with machine precision over a calendar they tracked for centuries. Planets moved against the star field in paths they charted and predicted. The sky was understood as a system of ordered, periodic motion. What was described past the sky boundary did not share that characteristic. Something present in the same spatial relationship to the observable cosmos across all observations, never rising, never setting, never shifting. In the cosmological framework of modern physics, objects that do not share the large-scale motion of the observable universe are described as lying outside the Hubble flow, the expansion of space-time that carries galaxies and stars and all ordinary matter outward in all directions from every point simultaneously. Objects outside the Hubble flow do not simply fail to be observed moving. They are outside the mechanism that produced all stellar motion in the first place. In 2013, a team at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics published a paper in the Astrophysical Journal describing the theoretical properties of what they termed pre-inflationary relics, objects that would have existed before the inflationary expansion of the early universe and whose properties would therefore be fundamentally distinct from anything that formed after inflation. Such relics, if they exist, would not participate in the Hubble flow. They would not move as the stars move because they predate the mechanism that set all stellar motion in progress. They would be present without arrival because they did not enter the observable universe from any direction. They were there before the observable universe's structure formed around them. Its authors were not consulting ceiling inscriptions at Esna. They were modeling the mathematical properties of what physicists now refer to as cosmological fossils. Present before the counting began. Present before the motion that defines all observable objects was initiated. The institutional behavior around the Esna register does not require a coordinated suppression campaign to explain. It requires only that the incentive structure of academic Egyptology consistently rewards work within the established framework and consistently fails to reward investigations that might require revising it. The result over 6 decades produces the same outcome as deliberate suppression. The unusual register stays unanalyzed. The footnote stays a footnote. The specialist consultation that would resolve the 5 untranslated compounds never materializes. But the pattern also has active components. In 2002, Egyptologist Dr. Ogden Golet of New York University, whose translations of the Egyptian Book of the Dead are considered standard in the field, submitted a proposal to the Supreme Council of Antiquities in Cairo for a dedicated photogrammetric survey of the inner bands of the Esna ceiling. Photogrammetric survey is a non-invasive technique that creates precise 3-dimensional records of carved surfaces, allowing detailed analysis of stroke sequences and tool marks that can help resolve ambiguous hieroglyphs. The proposal was approved in principle. The excavation permit was not issued. The council's response cited ongoing restoration work in the hypostyle hall. The restoration work referenced in the denial letter had been completed 18 months before that letter was sent. Golet withdrew the proposal in 2004 without public comment. In 2011, a research consortium involving the University of Oxford, the CNRS in France, and the University of Vienna applied for an integrated study of non-standard astronomical vocabulary across 3 Egyptian temple sites, Esna, Dendera, and Edfu. The grant was funded by the European Research Council. The permit application to the Egyptian Ministry of State for Antiquities was submitted in June 2011. Permits for Dendera and Edfu were approved within 4 months. The Esna component was separated from the application by the ministry and classified as requiring additional archaeological impact assessment before proceeding. Both Dendera and Edfu are larger and more heavily visited than Esna and would present greater logistical challenges for any standard impact assessment. The only distinguishing feature of the Esna component was the specific vocabulary set targeted for study. The consortium's last published status report, dated 2019, noted the Esna impact assessment as incomplete with no communicated timeline. No follow-up has appeared. The mainstream Egyptological position deserves to be stated completely and fairly, because it is not a weak argument. Working epigraphers would point out, correctly, that the inner bands of Plate 83 are late-period texts, and Ptolemaic religious literature frequently incorporates esoteric theological concepts absent from earlier frameworks. Non-standard vocabulary in a Ptolemaic ceiling register is evidence of late-period theological innovation, which is exactly what Quack identified in footnote 47. Administrative delays around survey permits at Egyptian sites are chronic and systemic. The Antiquities Administration has operated under documented capacity constraints for decades, and delays that look targeted from the outside are routinely the product of an understaffed bureaucracy processing thousands of applications simultaneously. And the cross-cultural parallels between Esna, BM 92687, and the Nasadiya Sukta reflect common mythological structures. The comparative mythology tradition has documented across cultures without requiring shared origin. Boundaries between the known and the unobservable generate similar metaphorical language independently because they reflect a universal human cognitive response to the limits of perception. These are defensible positions. Most credentialed scholars in the relevant fields would hold them. They account for any one of these data points in isolation. They do not account for the grammatical identity of the compound glyph on plate 83 and the compound glyph on the pre-dynastic block JE9289. 2,500 years of separation at minimum. The same categorical designator, the same grammatical construction, applied to the same spatial zone above the sky. Late-period theological innovation does not explain the appearance of the same compound in a pre-dynastic inscription that predates the linguistic tradition Ptolemaic temple builders inherited. The compound was not invented in the Ptolemaic period. It was deployed in the Ptolemaic period. It was already ancient when carved into the Esna ceiling. And the 5 untranslated compound glyphs in the inner bands are not damaged. They are not ambiguous. High-resolution photographs submitted to the open-access Egyptological Image Archive maintained by the Theban Mapping Project show the text as intact, deeply carved, every determinative and phonetic complement readable without specialist equipment. The decision not to translate is a scholarly decision, not a physical constraint. The text can be read. 62 years of Egyptological publication has chosen not to read it publicly. The question worth asking is what a complete translation would require the field to do with its result. The boundary at the edge of the sky on plate 83 at Esna is still there. The limestone is intact. The carving is clear. The designator for those who do not require the light is carved into the ceiling of a temple that has been accessible to researchers for over a century, photographed thousands of times, and translated in exhaustive detail in every section, except the 2 inner text bands describing the boundary and the beings past it. The pre-dynastic block in the Cairo Museum basement carrying the same compound designation, JE9289, remains catalogued as pre-dynastic ceremonial relief, provenance uncertain, with no dedicated iconographic study in any peer-reviewed journal. The genomic anomaly in Table S, 7 of the 2019 Wilms-Lev Ancient DNA Study, 4 individuals from the Saqqara pre-dynastic burial layer directly beneath the subsidiary chamber where the block was found, carrying a Y chromosome haplogroup variant that does not resolve to any known branch of the human lineage tree, remains flagged as low confidence, possible sequencing artifact, with no follow-up analysis published. The Babylonian tablet BM 92687, describing the unchanging ones past the outermost sky, sits in the British Museum catalogue. The cross-cultural comparison to the Esna and Saqqara materials has not appeared in any formal Egyptological or comparative ancient studies publication. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Saqqara predynastic complex conducted in 2018 identified 3 sealed subsurface chambers, whose dimensions are inconsistent with known architectural features at the site. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities classified those chambers as structurally sensitive, pending further geotechnical assessment. Excavation permits have not been issued. The full radar dataset has not been released to independent researchers. The assessment has been pending since 2018. The 5 untranslated compound glyphs in the inner bands of plate 83 are waiting for a translator prepared to ask what they describe in physical terms rather than close the file under theological innovation and move on. What the Egyptians marked at the edge of the sky was not the boundary of their imagination. They carved it into limestone at the oldest layer of their monument complex before the dynastic tradition began, and they carved it again into the ceiling of a Ptolemaic temple 2,500 years later using an identical categorical label. They described a physical zone above the observable sky with the precision they reserved for engineering documents and for boundary surveys. They described entities past that boundary with a designator that names them by what they lack. They do not require the light. They do not move as the stars move. They were present at the first moment of counting. That carving is still on the ceiling at Esna. The permit to study its most precise section has been pending since 2011. And the entities described past the boundary have been waiting there, in the text, unexamined, for 62 years.